All right, welcome back. This is the LaRouche Pack Lincoln podcast. I'm your host, Mike Stager. And really, this podcast has been a discussion and presentation series by Bob Ingram. And this is our final. This is our 9th podcast. Bob will be doing a series, a live question and answer series. For those of you interested, keep an eye out for LaRouche Pack emails. Sign up for those. That will be only accessible to people that are on live in discussion with Bob, and the subject matter will range from everything we've discussed in this 9-part series of podcasts, as well as the application of these ideas in principle that Lincoln represents into the modern era, as we bring to bear what LaRouche Pack has said is the Lincoln-LaRouche-Trump coalition and new Republican Party. So, Bob, this has been an exciting discussion process, and there's more and more that we can continue to pull out of this, because Lincoln just seems to be the most profound individual, so uniquely American, and yet so universal at the same time, revered around the world. And so I think I should just hand it off to you for the final remarks, and then we'll see what kind of discussion we can have.
Okay, good. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, as Mike said, this is number 9. This is the final podcast before we do the discussion at some point in the next week or two. This one I've titled "With Malice Toward None, with Charity for All," and it's going to be somewhat reviewing some of the material that we've already covered, but bringing out certain important aspects of that material, certain things which are particularly relevant to the situation we find ourselves in today. Before I jump right into the material, however, I do want to just preface it by, addressing the question of why have we done these podcasts? What's the purpose of them? And why are they particularly important? Why is this subject of Abraham Lincoln critically important for the political fight that we are all now engaged in? I mean, you look around the country, and it's unprecedented political ferment. I mean, I lived through the 1960s. I lived through the anti-war marches in the street. I didn't participate in the civil rights movement, but I know people who did. A friend of mine was very active in it. And I certainly, as a young person, followed it closely on television and in the news. But it's still, what occurred then, 40, 50 years ago, is still not like the situation we're in today. The civil rights movement in particular does have important aspects of it, which actually I'm going to get to a little later, which are very relevant to where we are today. But what we are witnessing, what we are all part of, is really unprecedented. It's not even like a year ago. I mean, you go back to last summer, you go back to last fall, and Donald Trump was having rallies around the country with 30,000, 50,000, tens of thousands of people in city after city after city, an outpouring of people to support his campaign. But if you look at that, if you look at what was going on a year ago, this was mostly people who were coming out to support Donald Trump, which was fine and good. It's good they did that. But if you look at what's going on right now, it's really not quite the same, because what we are seeing is millions and millions of people who have now recognized that if they don't get active, if they don't stand up and fight, that we are going to lose this country. So we are seeing literally millions of Americans who are doing things not only that they never have done before, but that they never would have dreamed of doing, even 6 months ago or a year ago, who are getting active politically, who are speaking out, who are intervening into school board meetings, into central committee meetings, into, in all kinds of ways, intervening with their state legislators, with their congressmen, with their local officials. Millions of citizens of every walk of life, of every race, of every creed, of every kind of occupation, who are now stepping forward to fight politically to save the country. And we're in a situation where there is no telling how this is going to turn out. The future is unknown. All we have is a growing number of people willing to fight to save the country. So to get back to this question of why the Lincoln podcast, it is because it is our intention, certainly my intention or my belief, that with this kind of unprecedented mobilization, it is critically important that we define the principles upon which we are fighting. What is it that we are fighting for? What do we base our movement on? In a certain kind of way, you could say that we are committed to saving the soul of America. And I don't think that's just a trite thing. I don't think that's just a catchy phrase. I think it has real substance and real meaning. And in doing that, looking at Lincoln provides us with a guidepost, which really no other American figure does, despite the fact that we've had many great ones. I mean, it's not so long where these things, it hasn't been that long of a time since these kind of principles were known and recognized by the majority of Americans. And I would just refer people back to Martin Luther King, particularly, the speeches he was giving, the organizing he was doing in the, between 1960 and 1968. And to look at what he was saying then, what he was calling upon Americans to stand up and fight for. Now, Martin Luther King, if you look at, for instance, the speech he gave in 1963 in Washington, D.C., or many of his other speeches, he was challenging Americans. But what was it that he was challenging Americans to do? White Americans, Black Americans, everyone in this country. He was saying that it was past time that we begin to stand up for and honor the principles of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. He was very explicit on that we had to make the principles of the Declaration of Independence, we had to readopt them and recommit ourselves to those principles. Now, today you look at what we've got with Black Lives Matter, with critical race theory, with all this crap. What do they say? They say the Declaration of Independence was a racist document. They say explicitly that the Declaration of Independence was a white supremacist document. Now, that's not what Martin Luther King believed. And in a very real sense, the movement which we're organizing, properly understood, the movement we're trying to build and recruit people into is the actual successor of what Martin Luther King was doing. Because the only way to save this country is to return it to its founding principles. And that really is why we've been discussing Abraham Lincoln. Now, that's the important thing. But there's just one more very brief thing I want to say. I could omit it, but I think it really should be said, which is that some of you may have run into another organization called the Lincoln Project. And some of you may be somewhat familiar with what a slimy, treasonous role that organization is playing. For those not familiar with it, the Lincoln Project is an organization that was founded, I believe, in 2019. And it was founded for one reason and one reason only, explicitly, which was it was founded by Republicans, members of the Republican Party, in particular by former staffers and former colleagues of three individuals: John McCain, Mitt Romney, and George W. Bush, Republicans. And it was founded in 2019 for the explicit purpose of defeating Trump in his bid for re-election, of defeating Trump in the 2020 campaign. Now, you could call these people rhinos or what have you, but it's important to recognize, John McCain, Mitt Romney, George W. Bush, that this is, in a very real sense, the Republican Party establishment, or at least a big faction of the Republican Party establishment. And in 2019, 2020, they were committed to defeating Trump in the 2020 campaign. And the Lincoln Project is funded by some of the richest people in the country. There's over a dozen, maybe as many as 20 billionaires who have contributed money to the Lincoln Project. Just recently, Gordon Getty, who's also the financial backer of California Governor Newsom, Gordon Getty gave a big contribution to the Lincoln Project, just I think within the last couple of weeks or last month or so. And he's a billionaire, one of the richest people in California, and he gave money to the Lincoln Project. So it is important for people to recognize that our fight is not Democratic versus Republican. Not when you've got groups like the Lincoln Project and billionaires within the Republican Party who are doing everything in their power to destroy Donald Trump. Our fight is not Democratic versus Republican. It is on a higher level. And that, again, gets at the question of Lincoln. So that said, I'm going to dive into the material and I'm going to pick up on exactly that issue, which is I want to just return briefly to what I discussed in podcast number 4. Podcast number 4 was entitled Free Speech, Free Soil, Free Men. And the subject of that podcast was how Abraham Lincoln created the Republican Party in 1856, between 1856 and 1860. And, what I discussed in that podcast is that I discussed the founding convention of the Illinois Republican Party, which took place in the city of Bloomington, Illinois, in the summer of 1856. And I discussed how that convention was just bedlam. It was just chaotic, that you had people there from the the Whig Party, the Democratic Party, the Free Soil Party, the Know Nothing Party, all these different factions, all these different groups. They couldn't agree on anything. It was total chaos. Now, I'm not going to go back and review what I presented earlier in the earlier podcast, but I want to mention an anecdote which I did not mention in that podcast because I think it's useful for right now, which is that while that convention was going on, and while you had people who were, couldn't agree, and it was not clear if the convention was going to fail, if they were going to be able to found this party, or if people were just going to break up and go their separate ways, one of the organizers of the convention, and I don't have his name in front of me, but one of the organizers of the convention went to Abraham Lincoln and said, look, I don't think we're going to be able to do this. I don't think we're going to be able to get all these people to come together. And Lincoln answered him. And it's interesting what, in my mind, what Lincoln said for the situation we find ourselves in today. Now, bear in mind that most historians portray the Republican Party as it was founded in the mid to late 1850s as a continuation of the Whig Party, or simply a newer version of the Whig Party. All right, that's how it's generally portrayed, and that's how a lot of people see it. But anyway, here's what Lincoln said to the person who he was talking to at that convention while it was going on in 1856. And Lincoln said, look, the abolitionists are with us solidly. The free soilers are with us solidly. The know-nothing people, the know-nothing, people are all going to come along. They're all going to go with us. And that even many of the anti-slavery Democrats are going to come to us because they have nowhere else to go. He said the biggest problem we're going to have is going to be with the Whigs. Now think about that. Think about it in terms of the Republican Party today. He said the biggest problem is going to be with the Whigs. That's where the fight's going to be. So here's Lincoln, a lifelong Whig, saying that in creating this new party, the biggest problem is going to be with the Whigs. And the only reason why I bring this up is that, we're going to see. I mean, we know the Democrats. We know Pelosi. We know Ocasio-Cortez. We know these people. We know Chuck Schumer, but Trump is now back out fighting, right? Everyone knows that. He's back out holding rallies. He announced his suit, against Twitter and Facebook and Google. And clearly Trump is now, after taking a short break, I mean, he was never out of the fight morally or intellectually, but in terms of his activities, he's now back in this fight. He's out there, and he's going to lead it. But it is critical that, I mean, it is my view that what we are going to see in the coming weeks, even more so than we've seen up to this point, is that some of the most dangerous attacks on him are going to be coming out of the Republican Party, out of these networks associated with the Lincoln Project. Maybe dangerous is the wrong term. Maybe just despicable is a better term. But these are people tied in with the Bush crowd. These are people deeply connected to some of the richest interests in this country, connected at a high level to the intelligence community. And it is very important that we, recognize who our friends are and who our enemies are. The only way to do that is if we act on principle, is that our outlook must be the outlook of Lincoln. We must hold people to principle. So, as I said, I'm going to try to run through some of this quickly because I want to bring out certain things we've already discussed and make certain points about them. So this is going to be a little bit choppy, but that's how it goes. The second thing I want to bring up is I want to return once again to this question of national sovereignty and public credit. This is what I discussed in the podcast on the greenbacks. I forget which number that was, but I just want to return to that. And I actually wrote something out. It's about 1 page long, but I want to read it to you because if I just talked about it, I probably wouldn't get it quite right. So I want to read to you what I wrote on greenbacks and public credit. And it goes as follows. Constitutionally, the United States Treasury is empowered to issue fiat money and to put it into circulation as a form of national credit. It can lawfully do this in any way it chooses to do so, as supported by accompanying legislation. The greenbacks exemplify this policy of national public credit. Under Lincoln, the greenbacks were integral to the creation of the national banking system, and the greenbacks were used to capitalize the newly chartered banks who were part of that system. Sovereign public credit is just that. It is sovereign. It does not have to obey the bookkeeping rules of British finance. This matter was settled conclusively with the issue of demand notes in 1861 and United States notes in 1862, both defined as greenbacks. Fiat currency, which was completely unsecured except by the sovereign credit of the United States. The greenback issuance was halted and the greenbacks were withdrawn only under massive pressure from the British and their French and other imperial allies. The greenbacks demanded that all US currency must be convertible to gold. After Lincoln's assassination, frightened and deluded US senators surrendered to this blackmail and the greenbacks were withdrawn. Secondly, credit and the physical economy. Properly understood, a national bank is not a monetary or financial institution. It serves as an engine and a catalyst for the upward development of the physical economy. And its only reason for existing is to increase the rate of development of the physical economy and national physical productivity. Any other definition or understanding of a national bank is erroneous. It is not simply a financial institution. The soundness of the national bank and the soundness of the national currency itself must be measured in physical economic terms, not by accounting or bookkeeping methods. If the overall productivity of the nation is increasing, and if that rate of increase is also increasing, the bank and the currency are secure. No other measurement is allowed. This might require a revolution in financial accounting methods. The bookkeeping financial methods developed in 17th century Amsterdam are not appropriate to a world governed by an anti-entropic physical economic system. The development of a national credit system is not restricted to a national bank per se, that is, to a single institution, but rather to a nationwide credit system. The way in which Lincoln integrated the issuance of greenbacks with the private national banking system is a paradigm for a proper understanding and deployment of a national credit system. Ideally, fiat credit should be linked as much as possible directly to the development of the physical economy and increases in national physical productivity. A regulated national banking system will enhance several fold the deployment of that credit into useful purposes. Our approach is one of a sovereign credit system, which recognizes no higher authority and is restrained in its operation only by the United States Constitution and by treaties and agreements between sovereign nation states as to how the individual credit systems of these nations will function and cooperate amongst themselves. All imperial and monetarist rules of the marketplace are to be jettisoned. So that's not Lincoln. I mean, I wrote that, but I think it is coherent with Lincoln's Greenback policy. And I believe it is coherent with the way that Lyndon LaRouche also defined these matters. So I just wanted to do that because, you know, in the Zoom call, we're going to have this question of greenbacks, this question of sovereignty, this question of public credit, of national banking. You know, I spent 2 podcasts discussing this. Lyndon LaRouche wrote reams of articles about this question. And I just wanted to try to define it from how I understand it a little bit more precisely. And if people want to discuss this further, we can take this up in the discussion, the Zoom discussion, which will occur within the next week or two. So at this point, I want to take a little segue because we've been discussing some fairly important political issues. But as people who followed the podcast know, we spent quite a bit of time talking about Lincoln as a person and about his personal life. And I want to segue off into that for a little bit here. And the first thing that I want to discuss is the question of, you know, I brought up in these podcasts Lincoln's education, things that he was reading, you know, obviously Shakespeare, Robert Burns, many things that he was reading. But, you know, I don't think that I mentioned that during the 1840s, Lincoln began to read Edgar Allan Poe quite extensively, and he had a extremely high regard for Poe's writings. He held them in the highest esteem. He particularly, and this is, you know, verified by many people, he particularly admired Poe's poem, The Raven, and he was known to recite it on many occasions. You know, unfortunately, we have no record of that, no audio record of that. But he became so well known in his recitations of the Ravens that at various gatherings of smaller or larger groups of people, he would often be asked to recite this in front of an audience. He also admired many of Poe's short stories, and I read one letter that he wrote in which he mentions 2 by name, The Gold Bug and The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. And for those who are not familiar with those stories, they're very interesting stories. And I would urge you to read them. The other thing I want to mention in terms of Lincoln's reading is Lincoln, you know, really liked humor, as we all know from his stories, his wit, and what have you. And in the 1850s and during the Civil War, while he was in the White House, there were 3 authors who Lincoln read a lot. and recommending them to others. And you know, I'm not going to claim that these people are on the level of Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe, but Lincoln certainly liked them, and I do want to mention them here. And their writings are available, and you can read them. And I've looked into them, and I've read some of them. And the three people I want to mention, and Mike, if you're ready with those pictures, I'll just go through them briefly one by one. Do you have the first picture there? Well, actually, I was going to put that one up third. I don't know if you can put up one of the other two first. Doesn't matter which one. Yeah, either one of those two. The first one, this is actually a man named Charles Brown, who wrote under the name Artemus Ward. And he was sort of a real character. He became a friend of Mark Twain. He helped Twain out with his career. His writings, I can tell you, I've read some of them. They're a little bit crude. They are funny. I could tell you one sort of very, one story about Lincoln and Artemus Ward, which is that at the time that Lincoln had written out the Emancipation Proclamation, and which is clearly a very serious document, and Lincoln was going to read the Emancipation. He got his cabinet together, his cabinet, and he was going to read them the Emancipation Proclamation. And before he read them the Emancipation, he said, look, before I do this, I want to read you the latest story that I've read from Artemus Ward. And he proceeded to read his cabinet a little story entitled High-Handed Outrage at Utica by Artemus Ward. Now, I've read this story, and I can tell you it's a pretty bizarre story. And Lincoln thought that this was an appropriate thing to read to his cabinet before he read them the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's Artemus Ward. The next one, do you have the next one? Yeah. This is another person by the name of, his real name is David Locke, and he wrote under the name of Petroleum Nasby. You can see there, that's the cover of one of his books, Prophecies of Petroleum Nasby. And Nasby, people might remember in the very first podcast, I mentioned a book entitled Reminiscences of Abraham Lincoln, in which various people who knew Lincoln contributed, little essays to that book. And David Locke was one of the people who contributed an essay. And I'm going to just read you a couple of sentences from what Locke wrote in that book. Locke is the author of who wrote under the name Petroleum Nasby. So what David Locke wrote was, quote, "The Nasby letters, which I began writing in 1861, attracted President Lincoln's attention, and he was very much pleased with them. He read them regularly. He kept a pamphlet which contained the first number of the series in a drawer in his table, and it was his wont to read them on all occasions to his visitors, no matter who they might be or what their business were. In doing this, he seriously offended many of the great men of the Republican Party in this way." So I've read some of all of these guys, and Locke's stuff, the Nasby letters they're funny, they're humorous, they're, I wouldn't call them racy, but they're they certainly poke fun at a lot of people in I wouldn't call it sacrilegious, but a semi-scandalous way. And you could see why, if Lincoln was reading this with, some serious high-level figure in his office, that some of the stuffed shirts might get offended. All right, so why don't we go on to the third one? This is just a cover of a modern version, LibriVox version. I couldn't find an original thing, so I put this up. The third person is Robert Henry Newell, who wrote under the name Orpheus C. Kerr. And actually, Orpheus C. Kerr is a play on words for office seeker, because Lincoln was, inundated with office seekers, people who wanted him to get a job for them. And Lincoln loved Orpheus C. Kerr. And in fact, there's a general, someone who I'm not very familiar with, General Montgomery Meigs, and I don't know anything about him, but Lincoln told General Meigs that, Meigs, at one point they had a meeting, and Lincoln asked Meigs if he had ever read anything by Orpheus C. Kerr. And Meigs admitted that no, he had never done so, that he had never even heard of Orpheus C. Kerr. And Lincoln responded by saying, quote, "Anyone who has not read Orpheus C. Kerr is a heathen." So, according to a number of people who knew Lincoln personally, of all of these writers that I've mentioned, Orpheus C. Kerr was Lincoln's favorite. And I read several of these stories, and I can tell you they're pretty funny. They really are. So if you want to have some fun, and if you want to enjoy some of the authors that Lincoln enjoyed, you can look these three people up: Petroleum Nasby, Artemus Ward, Orpheus C. Kerr. They're all in the public domain. They're all available. You can find them. Now, since we're on this subject, you can take away that picture, Mike. Since we're on this subject of humor, I thought I would also give you a few more examples of Lincoln's wit. Look, I'm just wrapping this thing up here, and I want to wrap it up by, trying to cover as many bases as possible to just round out this picture of Lincoln, of who he was. And I'm not going to read Lincoln's long stories, because some of his stories are several pages long. But I thought I would just give you some, about a half a dozen examples of Lincoln's wit. I think most of these are from that book, Reminiscences of Lincoln, but I didn't write down who they were individually. But it's just people reporting stories of, of things that happened with them when they were with Lincoln, or things that they were present at where Lincoln was speaking. So I'll just run through these very quickly. The first one: a friend of mine was one of a delegation who called on Mr. Lincoln to ask the appointment of a gentleman as a commissioner to the Sandwich Islands. In other words, an office seeker. They presented their case as earnestly as possible, and besides his fitness for the appointment, they urged that he was in very bad health, and that a residence in that balmy climate of the Sandwich Islands would be of great benefit to him. The president closed the interview with this discouraging remark: "Gentlemen, I am sorry to say that there are 8 other applicants for that position, and they are all sicker than your man." So that's one story. Secondly, walking up Pennsylvania Avenue one evening with several other members on the road to the White House, a courier who had just dashed across the Long Bridge hailed us and told us the news that he was taking to the War Department. It seems that in the gray of that very morning, a rebel raid in Falls Church had surprised and captured a brigadier general and 12 army mules had captured a brigadier general and 12 army mules. Mr. Lincoln said instantly on hearing it, "How unfortunate. I can fill the place of the general in 5 minutes, but those mules cost us $200 apiece." Third story. At one point, Lincoln was prostrated in the White House by an attack of smallpox. He summoned one of his attendants and said to him, "Tell the office seekers to come to me at once, for now I have something I can give to all of them." The next one. The name of a most virulent and dishonest official, B, was mentioned. The name, I'm getting things here. The name of a most virulent and dishonest official, B, was mentioned. One who, though very brilliant, was very bad. It's a big thing for B, said Lincoln, that there is such a thing as deathbed repentance. And finally, someone once asked Lincoln how long a man's legs ought to be. Lincoln answered at once. That is a very serious question, and I have given much thought to it a great many times. Some should be longer and some should be shorter, but I want to tell you that a man's legs ought always to be long enough to reach from his body to the ground. So the I don't know what to say. I mean, these things crack me up, I'll tell you the truth. So I was going to read you some more reminiscences. I had trouble with that word. Lincoln always had trouble pronouncing words. I was going to read you some more reminiscences of Lincoln, but I think the only thing I'll read you out of that is a short excerpt from the oration given by William McKinley in February of 1896. It was an oration on Abraham Lincoln, which he gave in Chicago on February 12th, 1896. I'm not going to read you the whole oration. I'm just going to read you 2 paragraphs. But McKinley said the following: "The Declaration of Independence was Lincoln's handbook. Time and again, he expressed his belief in freedom and equality. On July 1st, 1854, Lincoln wrote, 'Most governments have been based practically on the denial of the equal rights of men. Ours began by affirming those rights. They said some men are too ignorant and vicious to share in government. Possibly so, said we, but by your system, you would always keep them ignorant and vicious. We propose to give all a chance, and we expect the weak to grow stronger, the ignorant wiser, and all better and happier together. We made the experiment, and the fruit is before us. Look at it, think of it.'" So that's McKinley quoting Lincoln. And then again, McKinley quotes Lincoln. He says, in his message of July 4th, 1861, Lincoln stated his purpose in these words: "I desire to preserve the government that it may be administered for all, as it was administered by the men who made it. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle to maintain in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, lift artificial burdens from all shoulders, and clear the paths of laudable pursuits for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. This is the leading object of the government for whose existence we contend. It is a quality of revolutions not to go by old lines or old laws, but to break up both and make new ones. And I just want to read that last sentence again. This is Lincoln. This is McKinley quoting Lincoln. It is a quality of revolutions not to go by old laws or old lines, but to break up both and to make new ones. So, I have another section here on Lincoln's compassion, but there's material I want to get to. So again, look, I take too many notes, and then I just have to cut as I go along. I mean, Lincoln was known for his compassion, for his deep feeling for people. During the Civil War, Stanton, generals, other people, they were constantly angry at Lincoln for the amount of pardons he was writing. He just did it all the time. And I have some examples of that, but I'm not going to read them. But there is one thing I do want to do in terms of this question of how deeply Lincoln felt things. That for him, the question of love, the question of agape, these were not things you discuss like you would in a classroom. These were matters which affected him. I don't even know how to put it. Nothing for him was merely an academic exercise. I mean, if people think back to what we were discussing on Shakespeare, this is all deeply personal to Lincoln. So what I want to do is I wanted to read to you a report on the day that Lincoln got the news that Edward Baker had been killed in battle. Mike, if you can put up the picture of Edward Baker. Yeah, just leave that up while I read this. For those of you who don't know, Edward Baker was one of Lincoln's closest friends. He had a long, distinguished career himself. He also, you see him there in uniform, although I think this is an earlier uniform. That might be from, I don't know when that picture was taken. But he is the only, Edward Baker, the only sitting member of the US Senate to die in battle. He was an elected US Senator who, when the war broke out, organized a troop of volunteers to fight in the war. He led them into battle, but he was still holding his seat in the Senate. And in fact, the last time he appeared in the Senate, where he gave a rousing patriotic speech in the Senate, he appeared in battle uniform, wearing his uniform. And he went from there directly to the battlefield, and he was killed. He's the only sitting US Senator to ever die in battle. Lincoln was so close to Baker that he named one of his sons Edward Baker Lincoln, after Baker. Again, this was written by one of the people who contributed to the book Reminiscences of Lincoln, but I didn't write down which one. But this is a report on the day that Lincoln received the news that Baker had been killed. He was killed at the Battle of Ball's Bluff in Northern Virginia. And it goes as follows. At that moment, the finale of the terrible disaster at Ball's Bluff, the retreat to the river, the plunge into the swirling water to escape the murderous fire from the rifles of the victorious Confederates. It was the news of the death of Colonel Baker which stunned President Lincoln. They were old-time friends, member of the Sangamon Bar, had ridden the circuits together, been opponents in debates, but friends forever. So strong was their friendship that Mr. Lincoln named his second son, Edward Baker. Baker had succeeded him in Congress, had immigrated to California to return as a US Senator, to become President Lincoln's strong right arm in the Senate, to advance at a bound to the front as one of the most eloquent orators of that body. Well do I recall Baker's tireless activity, commanding presence and height, and sparkling eye. His presence was an inspiration. What a scene was that a few weeks later when President Lincoln, supported by Senators Trumbull and Browning of Illinois, entered the draped chamber to attend the funeral services of his old friend. The tears rolled down his cheeks as he heard the words of Senator McDougal, recalling bygone scenes. I doubt if any of the many tragic events of President Lincoln's life ever stunned him so much as that unheralded message which came over the wires while he was beside the instrument of that mournful day, October 21st, 1861. So, look, I read this partially to honor Baker, who's unknown today, who really deserves a place in the pantheon of American patriots and heroes. But also to honor the Baker-Lincoln relationship, which I think is a part of who Lincoln was. You know, you can't explain Lincoln without knowing some of these things. Now, I want to sort of bring this to a close with two things. You could take the picture down now, Mike. I want to end by talking about Frederick Douglass, the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the Gettysburg Address, and sort of bring this whole thing to a conclusion. Among other things, the question of Frederick Douglass, I shouldn't give it the German pronunciation, Frederick Douglass, I think also reverberates with what I said earlier about Martin Luther King. Because of all this, again, you know, the filth, the brainwashing they're trying to force down in, you know, school children in the United States today. I want to read to you an excerpt from a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1852 on July 5th. It's a very famous speech. By these days it goes by the name of what to the slave is the 4th of July. That's how the speech is generally known today, and it's easy to find. Unfortunately, today, when people quote it, they only quote part of it. You know, they quote Frederick Douglass attacking slavery and attacking racism. So you get some of these people who quote this saying, see how even Frederick Douglass said it, see how racist the United States has always been. But they never, these people who do that never read or quote the full speech. And they never quote the part of the speech where Douglass gets to the heart of the argument, where he makes his most important point. And that's what I want to read to you. It's just 2 or 3 paragraphs. Frederick Douglass says, or said, I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution of the United States. It is a slander upon their memory, at least so I believe. There is not time now to argue the constitutional question at length, nor have I the ability to discuss it as it ought to be discussed. The subject has been handled with masterly power by Lysander Spooner, by William Goodell, by Samuel Sewall, and last, though not least, by Gerrit Smith. These gentlemen have, as I think, fully and clearly vindicated the Constitution from any design to support slavery for even an hour. Fellow citizens, there is no matter in which respect to which the people of the North have allowed themselves to be so ruinously imposed upon as that of the alleged pro-slavery character of the Constitution. In that document, I hold there is neither warrant, license, nor sanction of the hateful thing, but interpreted as it ought to be, interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the United States Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Read its preamble. Consider its purposes. Is slavery among them? Is it at the gateway or is it in the temple? It is neither. Take the Constitution according to its plain reading, and I define the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Change has now come over the affairs of mankind. And then a month after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass sent a message to Lincoln, a personal message from Douglass to Lincoln. And in that personal message, Douglass said, "We are all liberated by this proclamation. Everyone is liberated by this proclamation. The white man is liberated. The black man is liberated. The brave men now fighting the battles of the country against the rebels and traitors are now liberated. I congratulate you upon this amazing change, the amazing approximation toward the sacred truth of human liberty." And then later, so that was in 1863. Years later, in 1876, looking back on Lincoln and looking back at the Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass gave a speech in which he said, "Can any colored man or any white man friendly to the freedom of all men ever forget the night which followed the first day of January 1863, when the world was to see if Abraham Lincoln would prove to be as good as his word? I shall never forget that memorable night when in a distant city, I waited and watched at a public meeting with 3,000 others, not less anxious than myself, for the word of deliverance, which we have heard read today. Nor shall I ever forget the outburst of joy and thanksgiving that rent the air when the lightning brought to us the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's Frederick Douglass, who had a close relationship with Lincoln. And that's how Douglass viewed Lincoln. That's how Douglass viewed the Constitution, as he calls it, the glorious liberty document. That's how Douglass viewed the Declaration of Independence, right? And as Lincoln said, we are going to build our movement, our party, our movement on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So, look, the last thing that I want to do, and I hope people take this in the right way, I want to read to you the Gettysburg Address, and that's how I'm going to conclude. Now, I have it memorized, and I could recite it, and people think recitation is better, but I don't want to stumble over it. So I'm going to read it. And then there's one point I want to make about it, and that's how I'll end. I'm not going to try to interpret it by any means. There's no need for that. But there is going to be one point I want to make about it. But I'm going to read it beginning right now. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or to detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here gave thus far, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. what I want to point out, or what I want to just mention as a part of this, for those who are, almost everyone is familiar with the Gettysburg Address. And sometimes people think it's a little ironic where Lincoln says, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, because after all, the Gettysburg Address has become perhaps the most famous speech in the history of the United States, one of the most famous speeches in the history of the human race. So they think it's kind of ironic that Lincoln will say, will little note what's said there. But Lincoln goes on to say, it can never forget what they did here. And that's what I want to bring out, because that is what Lincoln is honoring. I mean, if you look at this speech, what is it? Who is it that Lincoln is honoring? He's honoring the men who fought on that battlefield. He's honoring those who gave their lives on that battlefield. And then he goes on to say that it is our job, our task, to take up that fight, to take up the great task remaining before us. He is calling upon us to have the same courage, to have the same commitment, to do no less than those who he's honoring who fought on that battlefield. And it's not just a nice speech. It is a call to arms which reaches across the decades to each of us today. Not to just talk about Lincoln, but to honor this call which he is making to each of us to rescue our country today in the crisis that we're facing. So that's a somber note to end on, but I think I will end there, and we can open it up for discussion, Mike. I mean, we can really, I jumped around and covered a lot of material, so we can really discuss almost anything.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's it's a good way to end. I mean, I think that the only appropriate discussion at this point would be, what do we do today? What would Lincoln, not Lincoln the president, because it's always easy to, it's not easy, but it's always a different question. But what would Lincoln the citizen, what would he be thinking today? What would he be approaching this? There was someone who wrote in a question asking, how did Lyndon LaRouche come to exemplify or express some of the ideas of Lincoln? And then they also asked, how did Donald Trump come to express the ideas of Lincoln? And, I was struck, there was this term, people may know of it. I didn't, it was somewhat a casual reference, that there's a thing called in American politics, the Lincoln Reflex. I guess it was maybe a reference to FDR that had happened then. But, you hear it and it was an casual academic term. But what I saw in 2016 and I think even what Donald Trump was shocked by, which was, he first did that huge stadium in Alabama, and it was just packed. Everyone said, well, everybody is racist in Alabama, so he's just got a bunch of racists in a 80,000 person football stadium or something. But it was such a reflex, such a response from the American people. And so, how would, I have something else I want to raise, but maybe just if we stick on this question of what would Lincoln as the citizen be doing today? It seems to me the where we start. If you have any, I mean, that's just kind of what comes to mind, because it really is. It's a model. It's not a model for simply the American system or economic policy. I mean, what coalesced out of these 9 discussions and our discussions in between through this entire process was how Lincoln transcended simply a discussion of policy, that he recognized that there was a, what Bruce Director recently called, in reference to Lyndon LaRouche's work, a 4th domain, where the third domain, the noosphere, is described as a question of mankind's actions upon the surface of the earth. So we're building infrastructure, we're extending credit, it's a policy level, but there's something that supersedes or transcends policy, which is the deciding factor in the core, and really probably human survival. And Lincoln seemed to grasp that.
Well, could I say something?
Yeah, please. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I think what you're getting at is critically important, maybe the most important thing. I mean, you look at Lincoln, you look at what I read, just the short excerpts I read from Frederick Douglass. You know, you look at, you know, Martin Luther King. It's the same thing, you know, because, you know, and I don't know, 3rd domain, 4th domain, maybe this is the 4th domain. I don't know. Bruce can explain it. But you know, it's, you know, acting on a principle, which you know to be true, and which is a principle governed in the highest conception of the human identity. I mean, there's love involved in it, Christian love, agape. You know, I you know, whether people want to hear that or not. It's a you know, that acting on a principle which you know to be true, and almost filling yourself up, your mind and your soul, with that principle, I mean, you know, I mean, this is what, you know, all of these really horrible type people deny, that there are no such thing as higher principles. You know, there's just, you know, pragmatic things. We're going to have this policy, we're going to have that policy. We're going to, you know, we're going to do all these things that, you know, this thing that human beings are just animals. We're governed by, you know, lust and greed and food and whatever else. Or even if we're not horrible animals, we, you know, we're still, it's all just, you know, practical relations and how do you get ahead. But you look at, you know, I mean, you look at Lincoln, you look at Frederick Douglass, you look at Martin Luther King, you look at Lyndon LaRouche. There is, you know, it's not just we're going to have a national. I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I spent actually more time than I intended to spend on this question of greenbacks and public credit tonight. We need all of these things, but beyond that, like you said, beyond just man acting on the biosphere, beyond that, there's a question of higher truthful principles, which are grounded in a recognition of the creative nature of what it means to be human, the fact that human beings are made in the image of God. It's grounded in a love of mankind, in a devotion to the future of mankind. And that's what you see in these people. And in a certain way, you know, that's what people see. I mean, I've never met Donald Trump. I do not know Donald Trump personally. I only know him from watching him, from listening to him. But what I see in him is a deep patriotism, committed to the founding principles of the United States. So it's in Trump. I can't say any more than that about Trump, really. But it's clearly there. It's in LaRouche. You could call it a Lincoln reflex, but I read you that quote from Frederick Douglass that he gave in 1852, where not the closing words in the speech, but the closing words in the excerpts of the speech that I read, where after he's talking about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, he says, a great change has now come over the affairs of mankind, and that's where we are right now. We're in a period where a great change has come over the affairs of mankind, of the United States, all of the people in the United States, and people know it. They have a sense of it. There's a political awakening going on, unlike anything we've ever seen before. And it's precisely in a period like this where people are yearning for more than just politics as usual. They say, okay, we're going to get rid of critical race theory. We're going to get rid of, these companies that are sending all of our jobs overseas. We're going to get rid of censorship by big tech. Okay, but there's more to the fight in terms of the kind of nation we want to build. And you could see, I don't know if I'm expressing it in the right way, but I think that's what you're getting at. What do you think?
Yeah, one of the things that I think we're confronting in this moment, where the great affairs of mankind are at stake, and it's the, you see, look at the nations of Africa or Central and South America, and you see, certainly this direct sphere of influence of the United States, largely impoverished nations. But if the United States loses its role as a self-governing nation, we've already committed great problems. The extensive wars we've unleashed in the last 20 years. I saw, I think we had it on our website on Brian Lance's article, or maybe it was a reference to that, but 70% of our banks have been shut down. We've launched perpetual states of war. We've bailed out some of the largest corrupt institutions in the country. That's happened while we still have some degree, though it's been abused. We still have some degree of self-government. If that's entirely ripped from us, if we become a police state, surveillance state, run by a permanent bureaucracy, then the hope for any of these nations who have been trampled on by these same bureaucracies, same globalist fascist programs, there'll be nothing to actually represent something different. And I think Lincoln saw the same thing. Perhaps more stark then, before the liberal era had taken over. Lincoln's still dealing with largely monarchies, and the level of economic development was, many of these places probably still close. Well, just not very advanced. It's more advanced today, even though it's got problems. But here's what I'm thinking: is you mentioned the problem, people like the Lincoln Project. And, there's a fight going on today amongst the generation 40 and under, which are really the decisive factor in this period. For people who were blind enough to go ahead and support Biden, especially 50 and certainly 60, people over 60 blind enough to go with Biden, but some people might have just reacted to the COVID, the fear. I mean, that was an age bracket that was targeted by COVID with higher death rates and so on. But this generation that's younger, many of them have been raised in an era where they are meant to be idealistic. They look for their identity is premised on a kind of political failure of the last 20 years. These last 20 years have been political failure. They've seen it, but they've also been indoctrinated into a program, which means you would shut down all the most important aspects of actual development. You shut down energy supply. You go after any kind of fossil fuel production. Without energy, you build nothing. You want to build infrastructure. You want to build better jobs. You want to build better cities. You want to build better water supply. You need power, and they're just shutting all of it down. And they've been, corralled into this dynamic. They're not staunch, unlike Lincoln's time, where you had people who were some people certainly staunch defenders of the principle of slavery itself, that slaves were better taken care of by a slave master than they were as employees of a corporation. So, I mean, staunch defenders. But today, the people most susceptible to a system of slavery are the young, and in some cases, what we would think would be idealistic, though they may be much more cynical than most young people were in previous periods. How does Lincoln approach that? How does this question of Christian love, how do we begin to challenge that? Because that seems to be the crux. If you break open that, our enemy stands on nothing. The Lincoln Project stands on the ability to brainwash and corral some of these layers, under 40, under 50, the people that watch Rachel Maddow, are lost. But there's a lot of people affected by this environment. And it seems to be the most critical question of, if not recruiting people to what Trump has unleashed, to neutralizing the grip on them from this outlook, from this idea that somehow all government's orientation has to be first and foremost to address the claim of climate apocalypse, which is much different. I mean, slavery was a practical argument, right? The people that argued for slavery made practical arguments. This is apocalyptic stuff. This is wild stuff. How do you think Lincoln would approach this question?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that directly, but there's a few things, a few observations. This is actually, I think, at least the importance of this lawsuit that Trump has filed on censorship. And we'll see where that goes. We'll see how many people join him on that. I'm not going to predict anything. Now, obviously, the question of outright censorship, kicking Trump off of Twitter, like was done, Facebook, and the way many other people have been deplatformed, censored, what have you. This is obviously, in and of itself, critically important. But there's also the broader, and in some senses more, deeper question involved, which this thing, the fight that's emerging right now, a lot of this could be brought out into the open. The way people think about it could be changed, because it's not just outright censorship. It's the use of the mass media, the use of the entertainment industry, the use of social media, to force people into conformity, You know, I mean, other things have been done on this as well. I mean, you think of this cancel culture, you know, you think of the Me Too movement, but the cancel culture is more important than the Me Too movement because, you know, it's more political. But but you know, look, you have this thing, you know, I mean, think of the United States. You're talking about the under 40 generation. Well, think of the United States, you know, in the last 20, 30 years. I mean, you know, Ronald Reagan left office when, in 1989, I believe. That was 32 years ago. So you're talking about people who grew up under Bill Clinton, well, first George Bush, then Bill Clinton, then George W. Bush, then Obama. You know, this is a period in which politics has been characterized by cynicism, corruption, you know, a continual sellout, meaningless wars, bailouts of Wall Street. And there's been very little there for people to believe in. There's been very little there for people to be inspired by. And it's all been reduced to grubby politics, real politics. And of course, this is all reinforced by the drug culture and the entertainment industry, you know, and live for today, live for your momentary pleasure, what have you. But the idea, you know, and everything is just reduced to this, and you know, there's no underlying principles governing what anybody in political life does. And then you have this corporate culture, and you know, the idea that you would believe in something, that you would believe in something profoundly, you know, has been under assault, partially in religious terms, but not just in religious terms. And you know, the pressure to sort of your life, you know, is drifting along, and you know, there's no real underlying mission to your life, and you're just living and existing, and the pressure to conform and get along, and you know, not do anything which is going to make you an outsider. I mean, this kind of social dynamic was written about decades ago in the 1950s. You know, but the pressure to conform has been profound. Yes, you can, in your individual life, you can get a tattoo different from anyone else's tattoo. You can get a hair color different from anyone else's hair color. You can listen to some bizarre kind of music, which, you know, no one else is listening to yet. You know, you could be the first one, you know. But the idea that you would break, like you're saying, the acceptance of global warming, the acceptance of climate change. Now, what they're trying to shove down our throats, the acceptance of, you know, institutionalized white racism. The idea that you would break with any of these things, you know, this immediately makes you a social pariah. This immediately makes you no longer acceptable to the shared beliefs that everyone has agreed to share. And, you know, if, you know, in one of the podcasts, I spent a few minutes discussing the wide awake movement that sprang up in 1860, where you had tens of thousands of people, young people. These were all young. Well, I think they were mostly men, 95% men, but, you know, young people marching in the streets in 1860 to get Lincoln elected. Candlelight parades, other kind of parades, you know, tens of thousands in cities marching in the streets to get Lincoln elected. You know, at a certain point, if you're a young person, you have to be willing to say, I'm courageous enough that I'm not going to go along to get along anymore. I'm not going to mouth something just because everyone else believes in it. I'm not going to, I'm not going to go along with this idea that we should shut down the whole country for, climate change, which is not even real. I'm not going to accept this green ideology. And, what it's going to require, I believe, is a lot of young people being willing to break with these things. But to do that, there's a step involved, which is not just that, well, I'm going to change my view on a particular policy. On this policy, I'll change my view X amount. On this other policy, I'm not ready to change my view yet. This sort of, no. You got to be willing to, you have to reach a point where you're going to say, I am no longer going to be governed by what other people think. I am no longer going to be governed by, a pressure to conform. I'm not going to lead my life that way. And I really think this is beginning to happen. And, you could see it. You have a lot of people right now who, just if you look at what we've seen so far around this question of censorship and First Amendment rights, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how this thing could develop into something which could change the way millions of people think about what they believe politically and what they, how they viewed this nation. So I don't know if that gets to what you were discussing, Mike, or not.
Yeah, it's hard. I think that was a really insightful response. The question of popular opinion, or the idea of externally versus internally determined, that you're driven by your own questions, your own thoughts. You're not responding to what questions or thoughts people say you should be having, to put it in one way. That really does get at the crux. What was raised was, why was it that the Whigs were the hardest to recruit? And you mentioned it, but why did Lincoln identify the rest? We had the abolitionists, we had even some of the pro-slave Democrats, because their commitment, I imagine, to the Union itself, or against this idea of the spread of slavery. But why were the Whigs so hard?
Well, first of all, a lot of the Whigs supported slavery, but by no means all of them, but a fair chunk of them were pro-slavery. But otherwise on the Democrats, one of the things that's interesting is a large number, I believe it's not only a majority, but it could be an overwhelming majority of leading Democrats in Illinois, in 1856, 1858. Eventually they all became Republicans and they all backed Lincoln in the 1860 election. So, the Democrats were not unrecruitable, and they aren't unrecruitable today. At least the ones who, except for the crazy ones. But in terms of the Whigs, I don't have look, they were always compromised on slavery. Plus, in a certain sense, the chart, I mentioned this before, and I don't want to exaggerate it, but what Andrew Jackson and his crazy friends, claimed was that the Whig Party was controlled by, rich bankers and rich businessmen, from New York and Boston and, that sort of thing, and that they really didn't give a damn about the common man. And Was that true? No, that was not true. But there was a germ of truth in it. You know, if you look at what Lincoln was doing, I mean, look, even when Lincoln, when he was in the state legislature and he was trying to build these railroads and trying to build these canals, and he was trying to support education and these things, he was constantly fighting, not just against some of the Democrats, but he was also constantly fighting against the leadership of the Whig Party in Illinois. He was always a maverick Whig. When he stood up and denounced the Mexican War with his spot resolution, when he introduced the bill in Congress to outlaw slavery in Washington, D.C. I think this was in 1848 or something, 49. He introduced the bill to outlaw slavery and abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. Almost none of the other Whig congressmen supported him. It was a political party with entrenched power, and a chunk of it was moneyed power. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't. I mean, look, the fact is, when the 1860 election rolled around, the majority of the Whig voters, probably the overwhelming majority of the Whig voters, voted for Lincoln. But there was still, he had to take the party over. He didn't take it over. He had to create something new, and then basically say to the Whigs, those of you who want to join with me, come along. And most of them came along, but it was on the principles that he was putting forward. I mean, I can't, give a forensic analysis of the Whig Party in 1856, but it was a mess. I mean, even before the last presidential campaign they ran, which I think was, did they run Winfield Scott in 56? I think they did. No, because they ran John Fremont in 56. The last presidential campaign they ran was in 52 with Winfield Scott. And that was the last Whig presidential campaign. And the Whig Party was falling apart at that point. It was just falling apart. But, some of the Whig leaders didn't want to admit it was falling apart. They didn't want to give up the ghost on it. So I don't know what else to say about it. But, as we discussed before, I mean, in a certain sense, there are people who would argue this with me, people who would disagree with me. But, if you look at the founding of the country, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, I mean, if you look at it the way Lincoln looked at it, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, if you look at the Constitution, if you look at Hamilton, if you look at the Washington administration, if you look at the concept of the republic they had, if you look at the intention they had, well, it's my view that, after the death of Hamilton, after the death of Washington, and once you get into the 1820s, that principled mission, the commitment as Lincoln had it, as he talks about it in the Gettysburg Address, that commitment to those principles, to that mission, to what America represented for all of humanity and the future of humanity, after Washington and Hamilton, it got lost. It got lost. There were good people who did good things, but the Whig Party was never clear on that mission, not in the way that Lincoln was. And Lincoln basically recreated it. He For Lincoln, what he was doing, you could call it a second American Revolution, but he was saying, we are going to return, we are going to re-recruit the population to the higher principles, the higher mission that it was founded upon, that the people, in the way that people in 1775 and 1776 were recruited to this. And as he said in what I discussed, I think last week, not just the separation from England, not just the separation, but a revolution for a higher mission, a future, of principles upon which we're going to create this republic as something new. And Lincoln said we have to return to that in 1856. And he just, he believed that, some of the entrenched power interests in the Whig Party were going to be a problem in doing that,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you see the parallels to, it's not a new party, but it is the same question of the Bush, Cheney, Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney Republican Party versus what actually has to be constituted, which is something that is not based on certain beholden practical interests, but is willing to say, we're going to premise this on a principle. And in some sense, I think that probably, to the extent that that can be communicated and made clear and demonstrable or demonstrated, I mean, I don't see anything more powerful than that to recruit the younger people we referenced, just a little earlier. I mean, because there's something so alluring and captivating when you see actual principle made manifest. There's something that for the minds that remain active and with integrity, there's something you can't reject about that. And that's, in some ways, the way the media played the last 4 years was to basically obfuscate, obscure, cover up, lie, denigrate what Trump had brought to bear, which was in some sense that principle. But it wasn't hard to do. I mean, with Gary Cohn and the Coneheads and all the other Wall Street factions and compromises in Congress, it was very easy. But I think what you just described, and Lincoln knew that, Washington and Hamilton knew it, and it was that quality. That's what Lynn knew. That's what Lyndon LaRouche knew. Was that you make that principle clear, you have the ability to build an army, and only by that means. There can be no practical compromise, no beholden interests that you kind of say yes, but when it comes to that issue, it's a full devotion. And if that's there perhaps there's nothing more powerful. Would you say there's nothing more powerful than that in these kinds of moments politically?
Yeah, I do. This idea, Lincoln says in there, last full measure of devotion. I mean, he's talking about soldiers who died on the battlefield, but he's also saying to the people he's talking to, people listening to his speech, that they have to be ready to give the last full measure of devotion. Not necessarily die in battle, but have the same commitment, the same devotion to the mission. And for young people today, that's alien. It's an alien thing. I should be committed to a mission. I should have devotion to a mission. What am I? What is this? What am I? A member of a cult? This idea that there are beautiful, truthful, moral principles that you can devote your life to. This has almost been, driven out of our society. It's a tragedy. Well, it's a potential tragedy because we haven't lost yet. But it's truly horrible, because if there's nothing that you can commit your life to, if there's no higher mission, if there's nothing good that you can really do in the world for the future, then what's the point of being alive? You know, what are you doing? Um, and the and this has been almost, you know, surgically removed from our society for 20, 30, 40 years by the oligarchy, by the British, you know, by the people that Barbara Boyd talked about, the existentialists who said, no, life is meaningless, you know, life is meaningless, you know. Um, the And we have to reawaken that. Your life can be something. Your life can be meaningful. You know, you can play a part. You can play an important part in ensuring a productive future for everyone else. You know, that's Lincoln's message to us. That's what the Gettysburg Address actually means. And the you know, just stop being afraid. Stop being afraid of you know, of committing yourself to something. Stop thinking that you have to conform to what your friends believe or your alleged friends believe. Um, you know, I mean, if you look at Davos, if you look at you know, these people, I mean, you know, I think Barbara in her latest video or in her latest posting on the Larouche-Pack website called it the London, Brussels, Geneva, Wall Street, British Empire. So that's the new definition of it. But that's it. These are the most powerful people in the world. And they're going to kill all of us. And they're going to destroy every nation on the planet and impose police state rule. So what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? It's time to get involved in the fight, you know? It's time to get involved in the fight. And I tell you, we're not, you know, huddled in a corner, you know, frightened against the big bad oligarchy. I mean, Trump is out there swinging. We're recruiting left and right. There's ferment everywhere. People's eyes are being opened up everywhere. You know, as Frederick Douglass says, there's great change in the air. You know, if you decide to fight, if you decide to, you know, to do that, recognize that we're in a terrific situation. I mean, you know, it's bad, but, you know, when in your life have you seen so many people open to getting politically active? Never, never. So, you know, that's all I could say.
Yeah, I think that says it. I'm not sure we have much more to say. So, and that brings this discussion of Lincoln, at least in this podcast series, to a close. I think Larouche-Pack will be having some podcasts coming up infrequently. We have one planned on the drought crisis with Pat Ruckert, so keep an eye out for that. And Bob Ingram will be doing, as we said, either this Thursday or next. So that could be, I guess that's the 15th or the 22nd, something like that. Bob Ingram will be doing a live Zoom discussion on the questions of Lincoln. All the Greenback discussions and questions you have, gold standards, British banking, Federal Reserve, how Lincoln would address these things. I mean, Bob really knows this better than almost anyone. So I would encourage people to participate, sign up for that Zoom discussion. Bob, I just want to say thank you to taking the time to do the research, to pull this together in such an extensive way. And maybe you have some closing remarks or comments.
Well, it's been my pleasure to do it. And no, I have, all I could say is if you, you know, if you want to actually participate in the discussion on this and you're not on our mailing list, go to the Larouche-Pack website and on one of the
Get active.
Go to the Get Active page and you can sign up to get our emails, and you can actually pick which kind of emails you want if you don't want to get flooded with emails. but you can pick the emails to get invited to our live discussions. And then you'll get an invitation not only to the discussion we're going to have on Lincoln, but to our other things like our Saturday classes and what have you. So I would encourage everyone to do that. Other than that, no, I think we've covered it, and I hope everyone got something out of it. So I'll leave it at that.
Me too. Me too. Okay. Thanks, Bob. Thanks to the audience for participating, and we'll be in touch.
Okay. All
Bye.
right.